What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel DeBrock here, and today I'm going to answer the question, should you train to failure? Now, the objectives of this video are first to provide a quick overview of the current scientific evidence regarding failure training. Next, I want to highlight some really important considerations because obviously with any tactic, there are always going to be pros and cons. Next, I want to give some practical recommendations for implementation, as well as at the end, I'm actually going to give you a sample workout, walk you through the step-by-step rationale that I used to kind of create it, and hopefully it'll give you a little bit more applicability in terms of if you decide to do this in your program. So let's dive right into it. Now, let's look at what the research says about training to failure. So right now, there doesn't really appear to be a significant difference in terms of training to failure, like actual concentric muscular failure, or training 3 reps in reserve or less. So what that means is you're getting roughly equivocal results in terms of stimulus, but failure training is substantially more fatiguing. So pushing those extra couple of reps, even for a roughly equivocal outcome, is going to be substantially more fatiguing when sets are equated. Okay. Now, another really important point is that what the research shows when it comes to strength training is that it's probably not optimal for strength training. I say probably because nothing exists in a vacuum. You know, if we're talking just purely barbell squats, yeah, that's probably the case, but training is a little bit more dynamic than that. And there's obviously going to be cases where failure training might actually be pretty beneficial if you are a strength athlete even, right? And I'm going to go over what some of those caveats are. Now, some important considerations. Probably the first thing that people mention or ask when they kind of see what the research shows in aggregate, right, is, well, if they're roughly the same in terms of stimulus, is training to failure worse than non-failure training? And the answer is no. It's not worse. It's not better. It's not worse. They're just different. Now, like I said, with any tool, there's going to be pros and cons. There's going to be an effective way to use it and an ineffective way to use it. So if you look at this as a hammer, you don't want to try and use a hammer to screw in a screw, right? These are different things that need to be utilized at the appropriate times. So for instance, if we're doing a low bar barbell squat and we're taking that to failure, man, first of all, low bar squat probably is not going to be the best thing for muscle growth anyways. Like, it's super fatiguing and it's less concentrated in terms of where we're actually getting the stimulus, right? It's more distributed evenly across the back, the hips, and the quads, as opposed to, let's say, a front squat or a high bar squat or an SSB squat or a Smith machine squat is going to be targeting the quads a whole lot more, right? So we have to consider what exercise we're actually using. We have to consider the frequency that we're using failure training. We have to consider where it actually comes in the session, because if I do some heavy squats, but they're not to failure, and then I do some Bulgarian split squats to failure, well, I'm already fatigued from the squat, so I probably won't be able to actually generate as much fatigue from any subsequent exercise because fatigue is already accumulated. So it's really important that we kind of look at this in a little bit more of a nuanced way and don't just say, oh, well, failure training is pointless. It doesn't really matter, right? Because there's a place for a lot of different things. It's not just one size fits all. Next, it's really important that we differentiate muscular failure from cardiovascular failure. So again, if you're doing, let's say, a leg press, so a lot of people might take a leg press to failure, right? And, it's externally stabilized, it's very high output, it's not axial loaded really or anything like that. It's going to have a high output and high emphasis on your quads, right? So it's a great exercise for bodybuilding, building up your quads. However, that is brutal. Like, you might be doing 20 reps to failure or 30 reps to failure, depending on what rep range you're selecting. You might actually reach cardiovascular failure prior to reaching muscular failure. So this is a really important consideration as well. Now, this is doubly true if you're doing like a barbell exercise. If you're doing squats or deadlifts to failure, that is brutal, especially if you're doing like 15 reps. You might not just be able to handle it, not even from a muscular strength standpoint. You might just burn out before you even get the chance to reach failure. So it's really important that we differentiate between aerobic failure versus, or cardiovascular failure versus muscular failure. And we need to make sure that we're selecting the right exercises, we're sequencing them correctly, and we're giving ourselves enough of a build-up time to actually be able to hit true failure, and we're not having any sort of cardiovascular constraints, right? That's a really important thing to take into account as well. Now, this is, in my opinion, probably one of the biggest benefits of failure training. It's not necessarily a scientific rationale. It's not like, oh, you're going to get this amount of stimulus, it's going to, mTORs, blah, blah, blah. Nothing like that. It's actually just a practical consideration, which is that most people don't actually know what training to failure is. Even, more advanced athletes, every now and then, they'll hit a set and I'm like, no, keep going, keep going, keep going. And they might get 7, 8, 9, 10 more reps than they thought they actually could. And so it's really important that every now and then they actually have something to push them to true concentric failure so they can actually see where their boundaries and where their limitations actually are, as opposed to just kind of assuming, I'm tired, it's burning, it's really, hard, I'm going to stop here. Right. And that's obviously, it's not just like powerlifting, this is bodybuilding, right? But even for powerlifters as well, I've had that with clients that I've had for powerlifting, different strength athletes, as well as bodybuilders, right? So it's really important for that reason, is that you actually are forced to push yourself to that limit. And then you actually know where that limit is and you can gauge output a little bit more appropriately. Okay. Now, it's really important that technique needs to be prioritized for muscle as well as strength. If we have technical degradation, let's say we're doing like a whole lot of, like a hip thrust type bicep curl. Well, now we're using momentum. We're taking load and tension directly off the muscle, which is the intended musculature that we're trying to get a stimulus in. We're taking it off of there, and now we're putting it on our hips and our back and things like that. So there's not really any point in doing that if you're just going to mess it up, right? So we want to make sure we're reaching actual failure, but we're prioritizing technical preservation. Now, the same is obviously going to be true for strength. If you're doing really inefficient squats, you're just not going to be able to express maximal strength, but this is a little bit more focused on hypertrophy, so we're just going to kind of stick there. So one thing that's really important is that if technical preservation is really, really a priority here, probably not going to be very good for beginners, right? Or even kind of like early intermediates, because you need to make sure your technique is super, super solid to the point where we're actually able to push to concentric failure without actually having our technique break down prior, okay? So probably not very good for beginners or even early intermediates. And this is going to kind of be something you're going to gauge on a case-by-case basis. Excuse me. Now, if you train to failure, one of the benefits is you'll actually need less total sets. So total volume is decreased, right? Now, this can be a benefit. So again, if you're training for hypertrophy as well as strength, or if you just want to adopt a higher frequency approach, this can be very beneficial. You can have a really, really high output to less total volume, but then get more frequent sessions in with a higher output. So there's pros and cons to this, but again, total volume is going down. Now, exercise selection impacts the SRA curve and how much fatigue is actually accumulated. So SRA stands for stimulus recovery adaptation. So essentially, we introduce a stimulus into the organism that generates fatigue, then there's a recovery phase, and then they have the actual adaptation where now they're, have more muscle or more strength or more power or whatever it might be that you're training for, okay? So the time course of that adaptive process, can take, let's say, if we look at it from a week or a month or a year or even a day, right? That's really important, because if we do a crazy session, let's say we train, again, high bar squats to failure, it might take you 2 full weeks before you can actually hit your legs properly again, before they're actually recovered, right? Depending on how strong you are. If I was doing that, it would take me definitely about 7 to 10 days before I could actually hit a really hard session again, for sure. So, it's really important to understand that there's a big difference between that and doing, let's say, bicep curls to failure, right? Or easy bar curls or something like that. So 2 completely different exercises have completely different stimulus and fatigue profiles, right? You can train biceps really, really hard and probably recover within like 2 days and not be a big deal, which is, again, we see this a lot in bodybuilding, especially more recently, at least as far as I'm aware. I'm not super into the bodybuilding scene necessarily. I get people jacked, I get people really strong, but I don't really deal with contest prep. So just at least within my circles, it may not necessarily be true for the more hardcore bodybuilders out there, but in my circle, I have been seeing a little bit more of a research-based approach where people are starting to utilize a higher frequency with their training and implementing some of these strategies to get better results. They can do more, they can have more output more frequently throughout the week and get a little bit better results instead of just doing a huge day, trashing themselves and having to wait a full week, right? So there's some benefits there as well from a practical standpoint in terms of how much total volume we can fit in throughout the week from a frequency standpoint. Another kind of practical consideration is that differences in temperament might actually affect who this strategy might be effective for. So if you have individuals who, they like training, but they don't necessarily push super hard, they don't really enjoy that, probably not going to be a great strategy for them. They're probably going to be undershooting it, probably not going to get the best results. And because you're having to reduce their total volume, their results might actually go down. They might stagnate a little bit. Who knows, right? Whereas other individuals who like to push super, super hard, they like that. that might be a great way to allow them that kind of, to increase their engagement, increase their enjoyment in the actual training, but doing it in a way that's kind of going to constrain the amount of fatigue they can generate. Again, if we compare taking deadlifts to failure versus like a single arm dumbbell row, they're not even comparable in terms of the amount of fatigue they're going to generate. So dumbbell rows, you can recover relatively quickly. And this is something we see in powerlifting a lot as well, where a lot of powerlifters will train their backs almost every single session, whether they're benching, squatting, deadlifting, or doing kind of an accessory day. They train their back almost every day in a lot of cases anyways. And they'll do, let's say, 2 to 3 sets, because you can recover from 2 to 3 sets, no problem. But now you're getting 2 to 3 sets of super, super high output training every day. That might be 3, 4, 5 days a week, right? So again, it just depends on the individual, it depends on the context, but temperament does play a role in this as well. Now, one additional consideration is it might be beneficial because you actually get to shrink the amount of total time you spend in the gym. So this is another potential benefit if you're trying to kind of keep really efficient. Training to failure, because you're having to reduce the total volume, can allow you to get really, really high output into a more condensed period of time. So that could be a potential benefit as well from a practical standpoint. Now, let's go over some practical considerations of implementing failure training. Now, exercise selection and training to failure is really, really important. So the example that I gave earlier, let's take a low bar squat versus a bicep curl, or or even a low bar squat versus a leg press versus a hack squat versus a lunge versus a leg extension. Completely different in terms of how much stimulus, how much fatigue, and how long you'll actually need to rest before you can actually get in there and hit them hard again. Right? So these are really important. If we're looking at internal stabilization requirements versus external stabilization requirements, is it on like a fixed pulley system or a fixed, lever system, or are you having to stabilize like a barbell bench press, or even a dumbbell bench press? What are the loading considerations? How much fatigue are we generating because of the absolute load? So there's a variety of different things you need to consider, and the exercise selection is going to, in a large part, determine a lot of those things, right? So, another thing that is important to keep in mind is the acclimation period. If you're not used to training like this, you could probably expect that it's going to take you a couple of weeks to really, really get to it, either to work up to actually pushing to failure for all of those sets, or just to be able to actually tolerate it and recover effectively, right? It might take you 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, right? Usually in about 2 to 3 weeks, in my experience, people are fine, they're running with it. The first week is usually a little bit tougher, but then as you go on it's okay. But either way, you don't necessarily need to jump right in. And one of the things that I would maybe recommend is err on the side of caution, be a little bit more conservative. Don't just take your same amount of volume and then just change all of it to failure. That's just going to trash you, right? You probably want to reduce the volume a little bit, be a little bit more strategic in terms of where you're implementing the failure training initially, and then you can kind of expand it a little bit if you think that's the best thing for you, okay? Now, if you're a powerlifter or if you're a strength athlete and you're competitive, it's probably not a good idea to do this close to a meet. So it's definitely not recommended, because as you're peaking, as intensity starts to go up, volume is dropping off to some degree. So the intention there is to reduce fatigue, allow fatigue to decay, so you can actually express your strength. So if we want to reduce fatigue so we can express strength, doing a bunch of failure training is probably going to increase fatigue a lot more than just the other type of training that you might do. So probably not a very good idea to do, especially when you're getting closer to peaking, or if you're in those kind of higher intensity phases. So that's just a consideration to keep in mind. Now, again, prioritize technical preservation. This is really, really important. There's also a difference between technical failure and absolute concentric failure. So concentric muscular failure is, I just can't lift it. Like my muscle just cannot produce enough force to overcome the external load, okay? Whereas technical failure is, I failed because my technique is not sufficient enough to allow me to express my strength in this way. So again, if you're a novice, if you're kind of an early intermediate or something like that, probably not the best. If you are kind of a higher intermediate, or if your technique is pretty good, there might still be a gap between technical failure and absolute failure, and that's fine. You can still do that and still push in those ranges, because you're still going to be pushing at a very high intensity. But eventually, if this is technical failure and this is muscular failure, as you kind of become more advanced, that gap should shrink until eventually they're pretty much the same thing, where there isn't really a big difference between technical failure and absolute failure, right? So that's something to consider as well. Now, it's also likely beneficial to cycle the utilization of failure training. So just like you would with anything, it's important to make sure that we avoid staleness. Now, there's a lot of different explanations that have kind of been, or different hypotheses that have been put forward as to why people stop progressing when they get older, right? How come an advanced lifter stops seeing progress? How come they can't, or it becomes more difficult? Now, there's a lot of different rationales, but one of the rationales that I actually believe pretty heavily in is that eventually training just kind of becomes stale, right? And if we think about it like this, right? This is just me kind of off the cuff. This is just my opinion, and I'll be very clear about that. This isn't like a super sciencey thing. This is just my personal opinion. Having coached a lot of high-level athletes, a lot of elite athletes, even at the world level, world record holders, world champions, things like that. My personal opinion on this is that as you start to get better, training it becomes harder to stay more engaged. You've just been doing it for so long. There's not a whole lot of novelty in it. So being engaged is really important. And I think a lot of the times people have experienced this where they've been doing the same thing. It's been working. They've just been doing the same thing for a long time. It's like, man, I'm just fucking bored of doing 5x5 or whatever it might be, right? So then all of a sudden you change the block and it's, new exercises, new intensities, new sets and reps, new volume, whatever. And all of a sudden now you're really engaged. You're like, oh man, finally I get to do SSB squats instead of front squats or whatever it might be, right? Now you're more engaged, you're able to push harder, you pay more attention to the details, you're just more into the process and you have more enjoyment, which means generally speaking, you're going to get higher output if you're more engaged because you're going to push harder. So I think staleness is an incredibly important thing to keep in mind. And I think that's actually one of the bigger limiting factors when it comes to advanced athletes struggling to progress, is they just need to make sure that they're actually engaged in doing things that they really enjoy to allow them to continue progressing. So I think that's one thing that's really important to consider. So if you are going to utilize failure training or really anything else, it should probably be undulated in a way that allows it to remain novel and interesting and engaging. Now let's talk about how many reps, sets, etc. You should aim for. And at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I would give an example workout, kind of walk you through a potential example and give some rationales behind why we're structuring it like this. So this is just a sample workout. This could be a bodybuilding workout. It could be a power building workout. It could be really anything. It's just one workout in isolation. Don't read too much into the exercise selection or the total volumes or anything like that. I want you to pay more attention to the concepts that I'm kind of trying to convey here. So if we look at the first exercise, this is a wide grip barbell bench press. It's internally stabilized. It's a free weight movement. You have a high loading potential because it's a bench press versus a dumbbell bench press or dips or something like that, okay? So because we have a high output activity, we can do higher repetitions, and probably we don't want to generate as much fatigue. So we're going to do about three sets of 8 to 10 at a 2 to 3 RIR. So we're still giving ourselves a little bit of a buffer. We're not pushing that one to failure because we want to get a good stimulus, but we don't necessarily want to get substantially more fatigue. Okay, now as the sets go on, the RIR might start to drop. So we might start at a 3 RIR, by the end of it, we're at a 2 RIR, and so on. The next exercise, we're going to do incline machine bench press. Now we're going to do 2 sets of 12 to 15 at 0 RIR. So now we're actually pushing to failure. So here's the thing. Incline machine bench press is still a fairly big, compound movement. So how come I'm going to take that to failure? Didn't I recommend, avoiding that earlier? Well, yes. However, the first thing to consider is that we already took an exercise to accumulate fatigue. So we already fatigued you a little bit during the wide grip bench press. So because of that, your ability to maximize your weight on the bar is going to go down. So the absolute load is going to go down. So the amount of fatigue you can generate actually is lower than it would have been if you would have just started with the incline machine bench press. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is it's externally stabilized. It's going to be on a lever, right? Because it's a machine, we don't have the same internal stability requirements. So neurologically, it's less taxing. From a motor coordination standpoint, it's less taxing. So we're able to have a higher output without it generating quite as much fatigue as bench press. Now, you could just as easily set this at 2 to 3 RIR and then do the shoulder press and the other ones to failure. And that'll be perfectly fine. This is just an example to kind of give you a little bit more potential application in when you're designing your own workouts. Next, what we're going to do is a shoulder dumbbell press. I like to use this sometimes on accessories where we'll do kind of like a top set and then back off work strategy. So one set is 1 times 10 to 12 reps, and the second set is 12 to 15 reps, both at 1 to 2 RIR. Okay, now you could just as easily do 2 sets at 10 to 12, 2 sets at 12 to 15, 2 sets at 8 to 10, doesn't really matter. This is just an example. And then the last one, we're going to use a superset. So we're doing single arm cable overhead tricep extensions for 2 sets of 12 to 15 to failure. And then we're doing dumbbell reverse fly, 2 sets of 12 to 15, also to failure. So it's a superset. So again, as I mentioned earlier, if we are taking a bench press to failure, that's going to be substantially more fatiguing than taking a reverse fly to failure, right? So I could do reverse flies to failure probably 4 or 5 times a week, and I'd still be okay. You're only doing 2 sets, not a big deal. You're going to recover pretty damn quick. So it's not going to be super fatiguing. So again, even though the fatigue is a little bit higher, total volume is a little lower, we can have a higher frequency, so really high output, potentially maybe even do more volume throughout the week and be a little bit better recovered either way. So it just depends on how you want to structure it. Again, this is one workout in isolation. You'd really have to look at the entire week to determine what's going to be the best approach for where you're going to incorporate your failure training. And you could even undulate it week by week. You could have an A-B week. You could have a 2x per week frequency. You could have a whole host of different things. This is just one example to kind of get you there. Now, I hope I answered that question. I hope you found a lot of value in this video. If you liked the video, make sure you share, make sure you subscribe, because I put out more videos like this every single week. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.